well, whatever our spiritual path may be, whether we're Buddhist or Sufi or Christian or non-aligned or whatever it is, at the core of our concern, our worship, our practice, our ideas is the notion of unconditional love. And so I want to say one or two things around this subject of unconditional love. And unconditional love is like a venomous snake, basically. In the Buddhist texts, there is one of the most famous discourses of the Buddha. It's called the Snake Simile Sutta. The Buddha's discourse in which he uses the analogy of a snake. And it begins, the Buddha says, well, if a person goes in search of a snake, needs a snake, has a use for a snake, and you might initially think, well, who would have a need for a snake? But in those days, they derived, as medical science still does actually, powerful medicines from snake venom. And many of the Buddha's early followers would have practiced the medicine of their day. Bhikkhu, wandering from village to village, did not only dispense spiritual remedies, wisdom, they also treated the sick. The relationship between the healer and the wandering sage, very close in that ancient world. So, a bhikkhu, a follower of Buddha, might well need a snake in the literal sense, might go out and catch a snake. And the Buddha's point is that if you catch hold of a venomous snake in the wrong way, if you get hold of it by the wrong end, it'll just run back up its length and bite you, and that will be mortal injury. Unconditional love is like that. You can get hold of it in different ways. You can get hold of it at one end, or you can get hold of it at the other end. If we really take the sense of unconditional love, if it's unconditional, then it's not bounded by space or time or circumstance. Unconditional love must be everywhere all the time. We must already be swimming in an ocean of unconditional love. And if we can open our minds, open our hearts, open our being to the fact that we are receiving, bathing in, breathing, touching unconditional love all the days of our life, now, then, and again, then we will be in a state of spiritual rapture. We will be in the state of the mystic sages. That will be the pinnacle of our spiritual life, for sure. At the same time, of course, if we make unconditional love our standard, the standard by which we judge the things around us, by which we measure things, by which we assess our own conduct, by which we assess the conduct of others, by which we assess our feelings, the feelings that others have towards ourselves or towards other people in our world, then the fact is that everything we ever encounter is going to fall short. We are going to have, as the material with which to create the work of art that is our life, we will have a palette composed entirely of deficiencies, shortfalls, and unsatisfactory elements. And with a palette of that kind, we can do nothing but paint a picture of misery and unsatisfactoriness. And a lot of us, of course, in varying degrees, live in such an unsatisfactory world. We live in a world of dukkha. And how do we get from one of these visions to the other? How do we stop picking up the snake by the wrong end and getting bitten? And how do we find a way to extract the venom from the snake and make it into the most marvelous medicine, which will cure all the woes of human existence? To achieve this, we need a change of heart. We need a turning around in our seat of consciousness, as we say. A change of heart. Yeah? We need to look at things in a new way. We need to get hold of the snake at the other end. Now, what did Buddha do? We can say Buddha loved all beings, all sentient beings unconditionally. So we start from this idea. What can we say from the example of his life? After all, Buddha was a man who lived in a human body in this conditional world. So how can we say Buddha lived unconditionally? How can we say he loved unconditionally? What did he do that constituted his unconditional love? Well, of course, when we read the texts and we think about Buddhism and we learn go to our Dharma classes and learn, our attention is largely held by what the Buddha gave, by the teachings that he gave to others. And perhaps we miss something of the actual substance of his life. Because most of the teachings that Buddha gave were really, they were his accounts of his own experience. They are accounts of how he found it, how it was for him. When he talks about Four Noble Truths, Eightfold Path, non-self, these things, he's talking about the experience of his own awakening. It's not like he's saying, and you should this, and you should that. He's saying, well, for me it was like this. And you're left to draw your own conclusions. The Buddha leaves the other person free. Many people came to the Buddha, had an encounter with him, went away and felt massively transformed. That brief relationship, a relationship of perhaps half an hour or an hour or two, changed their whole life. Yeah? And one of undoubtedly one of the great elements of this was that the Buddha allowed the other person to be free. When we say, innumerable are sentient beings, I vow to save them all, what are we saving them from? Well, one of the things we can start by saving them from is ourselves. If we stop laying trips on them, that will save all sentient beings a great deal of trouble. They'll be liberated from us. This is one little thing we can do for the universe. And this is what Buddha did. Really, Buddha liberated the universe from him, from the trip that earlier in his life he'd been laying on other people. And in the early part of his life, as we know, he became unhappy in all the relationships he had. He left his marriage, he left his child, he left his teachers, he left his friends. All Buddha's early relationships were failures. He went through a relationship failure sequence and finally broke through the sort of ultimate barrier when he was totally alone and deserted and had deserted everybody. So Buddha's early experience of relationships was not good, starting from the death of his mother, when no doubt he was left with deep psychological dilemmas that he had to struggle with through his life. But there's a step beyond this. What was Buddha's relationship to the world around him, the people around him? What did he do? he made himself vulnerable. He made himself dependent. This runs so much in the face of what is often held up as our kind of contemporary social ideal. The Buddha walked the countryside with nothing but his begging bowl. He stored up nothing for the morrow. If he got fed today, he got fed. If he didn't get fed, he was hungry until the next day. This is a state of great vulnerability. This is a state in which he was always dependent upon the other people. I think this is one of the really difficult things for us to digest. We have such a strong social norm of independence being the ideal. And yet the reality is none of us is independent. We are dependent upon food supplies that we did not create. We're dependent upon sunshine that comes to us from a star far away. We're dependent upon the air we breathe that none of us earned. We're dependent on all sorts of things. And in being social animals living in complex societies, as human beings, we're very dependent on other people, on one another. Buddha was willing to face the reality of this dependency and actually face it more completely than any of us ever do. He was willing to put himself in that position of being vulnerable, open, knowing that his life was all the time in other people's hands. Can we make ourselves that vulnerable? This is a big challenge. If we want our lives to come even in the sort of distant orbit of unconditional love, this is the kind of thing we have to think about. We are dependent beings. Can we allow ourselves to feel that without then feeling self-pitying, resentful, negative, and so on? Can we be in that position where we are the recipients of such bounty, such wonderful gifts, and simply feel gratitude? What Buddha did was to allow people to love him. This probably was a more powerful part of his message than the fact that he evidently loved them. Well, when we say in our texts, how will one become a Buddha in the future? The answer in the text is usually by making offerings to innumerable Buddhas. Buddhas just sit there and receive our offering. Yeah? They receive. We give love to them, and their gift essentially is to allow us to love them. Many of us find it difficult enough to love, but even more difficult to be loved, and to be loved in the way that the other person chooses to love us. After all, when the Buddha puts out his bowl, he doesn't have a little notice on it saying, only the following ingredients, please, or he doesn't lay a whole load of conditions on what goes into that bowl, or how it goes in, or etc. People just give what they give, and the Buddha receives it. Now this is when we make an offering to the Buddha, this is not a trade. This is not a contract. This is not a negotiated rational agreement. This is unilateral action on both sides. The Buddha is unilateral in being there. The person who gives the gift is unilateral in giving their gift. And this unilateral quality is what makes relationships special. An intimate relationship is not a rationally worked out contract. It's something in which each person makes offerings. In a good relationship, at one point, one person is the Buddha and the other person is making offerings. At another point, the other person is the Buddha and the first person is making offerings. We make offerings to one another, treating one another as Buddhas. This means, in the sense that what we do is unilateral. The actual act is unconditional. It's not a trade. It's not a way of getting something in return. It's not the working out of an agreement. It's not something done under the coercion of a commitment of some kind. We talk a lot about commitment, and perhaps I'll have to come back to that. But in the moment of love occurring, there isn't really commitment. There's simply unconditional, unilateral love being given at that point. And the great genius of Buddha was that he made himself open to that kind of encounter with other people. We, in our everyday lives, maybe only have fragments of it. But those fragments are fragments of pure gold. And that's what we're looking for when we're looking at the relevance of unconditional love, or even of any kind of love in our daily lives. So, as it were, in summary, truly unconditional love is already there. We're already receiving it. We can found our practice on gratitude. If we're grounded in gratitude, we can afford to be open and unconditional in the sense of unilateral. What we do is from our side. I give. And if people are giving to one another, then it's as important to receive as to give. In fact, in many ways it's more important to be in a position where you can receive, truly receive, than the giving part. And these will all flow together naturally. These are the important aspects.